Now to the Albanese government's social media crackdown that would hit social media giants with millions of dollars in fines if they repeatedly failed to remove disinformation and misinformation upon requests by the Australian Communications and Media Authority, known as ACMA. Now, I understand that there is a lot of awful content online, but that doesn't seem to be the target of these laws, which appear to offer censorship of a political nature more than anything else. And it begs the question, if Labor are prepared to legislate for political censorship, why aren't they prepared to act to stop other forms of harmful content, like children being able to access pornography without age verification? It's disturbing enough that the government want to have the final say on what constitutes fact and what is false. Just think what this could mean for problem solving and innovation. What would have happened if the people who thought the Earth was round had been silenced and fined just because the flat earthers were then in vogue? Or, to use a more recent example, many of the people mocked and shamed at the time of the pandemic for their scepticism about the effectiveness of many of the measures imposed by government have turned out to be right. No doubt they would have been censored and fined under this law. But here's the kicker. The law expressly excludes the government from being capable of misinformation. After all, the government isn't capable of making a mistake or getting it wrong, right? It's a bit of a joke, isn't it? But if it's the opposition or another political party, well, they are all subject to this new law. There's an interesting question to be answered about whether this is even constitutional. There's case law that has in the past taken a dim view of restrictions on speech that touch issues relevant to elections, because our constitution carries with it an implied freedom of political communication. But if it were to pass, it would herald an ugly new era of political censorship designed to entrench incumbents, censor criticism of the government, and dismiss anyone who dares to challenge them as liars, or, should I say it in newspeak, misinformed, and weaponise the tech giants to make all of this happen. To some extent, the social media companies are already headed down this path. When YouTube takes down videos that ask, "What is a woman?" as it has done for many prominent conservative thinkers in recent times, or when Twitter greys out posts as being offensive merely for discussing matters of legitimate public debate, or forces them to carry a label warning users that, in effect, the poster is a liar, it is really adopting a version of this approach. You can see the way that this follows the contour of popular woke values too, rather than biological or historical truth. But this will provide a licence for the tech giants to step it up, to double down, and to say it's all done at your democratic request. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't recall anyone seeking a mandate for this at the last election. And so you might ask, why now? What's the rush? What's the driver to do this, especially given the risk it presents to freedom of thought and speech in this country? Well, it seems to me that there's a very neat link between this bill and the flagging support for the proposal to change Australia's constitution. How to deal with the fact that Australians are listening to the no side of the campaign, even though it's being outspent 8-1 by the yes side and its corporate funders? Well, if you don't have a good argument of your own in support, just ban the other side from speaking. Call it misinformation or disinformation and threaten anyone who lets them speak with a big old fine. Of course, the government will remain exempt and free to continue to speak in broad, nebulous terms that conceal the real agenda and the real risks presented by the voice. Joining me now to discuss this is Liberal Senator for Tasmania, Claire Chandler. Claire, welcome to the program. You've written brilliantly in The Spectator about this bill recently, and you said, who do you trust to determine what is true and what is false? To determine which news and opinion is allowed to be published and which should be banned to protect public health and safety? It's a fair bet that Twitter, Facebook, the media and government aren't at the top of your list. Couldn't have said it better myself, Senator. What stands out to you as the biggest risk of this bill?
Well, thank you for having me on the show once again, Amanda. Look, there are a lot of red flags with this bill that's been proposed by the Albanese government, but I think the biggest red flag for me is the fact that they're exempting anything that they or their members say from being regarded as misinformation. But at the same time, anybody from the opposition or from another political party, or indeed any member of the public that criticises anything that the government has, could be considered as spreading misinformation. And I think this is incredibly Orwellian stuff where the government is allowed to say what they like, but anybody who criticises it can be shut down.
It's really interesting. I mean, we all know there's lots of rubbish on the internet, lots of stuff that isn't true, lots of misinformation and disinformation. But what's the right way to go about dealing with that problem?
Well, you're entirely right. We all know that there is material on the internet that is false or incorrect. And I think first and foremost, members of the public should be able to use their brains and their critical thought to determine what is wrong and what's true and what's false. But the other problem with this bill is that it puts debate or comment that the government might disagree with in exactly the same basket as disinformation from foreign agents. I mean, obviously the government should be doing everything it can to disincentivise the spreading of information that has its origins with a foreign agent, disinformation by foreign powers. That's a noble cause, but to lump it all in with any other kind of debate, I think is incredibly disingenuous.
Do we have any idea of what the actual criteria that ACMA is proposing to use to decide what will be misinformation?
Sure. So the draft bill that has been released defines information or misinformation as any information that is false, misleading or deceptive that would be reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. And for mine, that definition is far too subjective for my liking. We all know what happens when we leave lawyers in the courts to decide what information is or isn't right, or whether or not something is harmful. And look, I think there's no doubt that we're seeing this term misinformation being used as the new hate speech, which we know was the term that we used to use, say, 5 or so years ago when we wanted to silence dissent or silence debate on a particular topic.
No doubt the left will still want to use that one, but we should learn a lesson from the law as it evolved in relation to hate speech, so that what was called harm when it first came out, so to speak, was physical harm. It didn't take too long before hurt feelings were in the basket of harm. Knowing what that term means is going to be very important. I think the most obvious example of how this could play out in the short term is with The Voice. Do you think this is being deliberately pushed as a way of influencing the campaign for the referendum later this year?
Look, I suspect a Labor government would never shy away from the opportunity to silence any form of dissent on its performance whatsoever. But look, I do think that the fact that the Voice debate is coming at the end of the year has sort of precipitated the government bringing this bill forward when they are. I mean, you only have to look at the example that we've seen in recent weeks of a minister in the government saying something which was clearly misleading, which was that the Voice wouldn't have anything to say about the concept of Australia Day being on the 26th of January. So that, even though it's clearly false, wouldn't be misinformation under this bill. But again, anybody who criticises that statement from the minister or who asks even some questions about the validity of that statement of the minister could be accused on social media of spreading disinformation, even if they're just commenting on a Facebook post about it.
And so to understand just how far this can go, that means it would be okay for Minister Burney's answer to that question, even though it's wrong, to be posted online, shared far and wide, but not anything that pointed out it was wrong. It's very worrying. Finally, and very quickly, you've always been prepared to engage in the tough conversations, particularly around women's spaces and the needs of biological women. It's really pretty hard to get heard on anything that doesn't fit the woke cookie cutter on that space. Are you concerned that subjects like this that really need to be on the agenda could easily be shut down?
Oh, look, absolutely. I think longer term issues such as women's sex-based rights is absolutely on the list of those topics that government will try and silence dissent on. And I have a very clear-cut example of this, of previously finding out that the ABS was claiming that biological sex can change over a person's lifetime. Clearly, that is not true. That could be determined misinformation by a normal, everyday understanding of it. But again, under this legislation, as a government entity, the ABS would be able to say exactly that and not face any criticism of it. Conversely, people such as myself or other women that decided to shine a light on just how false or misleading that statement was could be deplatformed. So, look, I think there are a long list of topics that the government has in its sights in introducing this bill. The Voice is number one, and I think a lot of these other broader social issues are certainly up there as well.